Good afternoon, listeners. I am Barbara Askins, and I am the host of 125th Street and Beyond. 125th Street and Beyond is a radio show about the work we are doing at the 125th Street Business Improvement District, better known as BID, here in Harlem. It is also a show about the relationships we are building with city agencies, BIDs around the world, and our neighbors here in Harlem. We will be giving updates on what's happening and addressing issues that impact the commercial district. Our guest today is Barbara Blair, one of my colleagues, a BID manager, president of the Garment District Alliance in New York City, formerly known as the Fashion Center, one of 78 business improvement districts in New York City. She has led the nonprofit organization, which represents the interests of garment and other businesses in the neighborhood since its formation in 1995. Barbara, welcome to the show.
Barbara, thank you so much for having me, and it's wonderful to be with you always.
Yeah, it is kind of fun for the two Barbaras to get together, right?
It
So let's begin by you telling us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? What led you to do this type of work? And how did you end up in your current position in the Garment District?
Sure. Well, like so much else in life, it was sort of serendipity how I ended up here. I had worked my first job was from MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, doing events. And then from there, I did a huge event for Airbus Industry of North America, which is a wide body jet manufacturer. So that included a lot of marketing and a lot of events. And then I went to a nonprofit organization for executive women in the fashion industry. And I was there for a number of years. They were all senior women in fashion. And when this job opened up at the BID, a friend of mine who was on the board said, why don't you apply for this? And I did. And why I say serendipity is I didn't come out of public administration. I did go back and get a master's in public administration from NYU, but I came out of sort of marketing, programming, events, that kind of thing. The reason I got the job is because I knew a lot about the fashion industry. And at that time, there were many more fashion companies in the Garment District, and they wanted somebody that understood the industry. So there was a big learning curve, to be honest with you, because I had never worked for a public agency and I had never worked for an urban development agency. So it was, as I said, serendipity, but I've been here, don't ask me how long, and it's fascinating work just because of how much turf it covers.
And so one of the things I want to do in this, in this interview is to show our comparisons. So it was sort of like serendipity for me as well. I had been doing public involvement, transportation, facility planning, and environmental projects, in the city. And we were working with the MWBE program, and we had 35 certifications in, different states. I mean, it was about 35 different states. And 125th Street was in the midst of a street reconstruction project, which I had done a lot of work with public involvement in that. So it became the natural for me. And the whole thing was to improve the streets and create a business improvement district to maintain the improvements. And that's what brought me to the whole thing of business improvement districts and stuff. And like you said, learning curve. And at that time, I think those of us this was in 1993, those of us who were in that space was charting the waters. There were few BIDs that were there and they all were helping us, but still we were all learning from each other at that time. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's really so true, because I remember those early years, and I remember having to go around with my colleagues that were BID directors doing dog and pony shows with commissioners and deputy mayors and agencies to say, this is who we are. This is what we do. I mean, we're a nonprofit, privately funded, but we do quality of life improvements in neighborhoods. Nobody, even in the city, except for the Department of Small Business Services, understood that there was a private entity that was sort of doing an overlay of city services, sanitation, security being the most important ones for us at the time. So duplicating efforts in a lot of ways, but making the efforts more robust in certain neighborhoods. And I remember trying to tell DOT what we were.
Right, right. And we were duplicating only because what was required was not being provided.
Exactly.
So it was on the books of what some of the agencies should be doing, but it wasn't happening, which was the impetus for bids coming in, into fruition to chart their own, destination. Like, because services are not here, we can't sit here and go under. But
well, there had been so many service cuts in the city back in those days, in the like 1990, 91, 92. And, the property owners who, in fairness, their assets are these New York City properties, but our assets, meaning the citizens of New York, are also their properties because they're our neighborhoods.
Right.
And New York, frankly, was going to hell in a handbasket.
Yes.
Sanitation was dreadful. Security was, we don't even have a security problem right now compared to them, except for
Yes.
that we do, because there's a whole 2 generations of people that grew up in New York not knowing there were security problems.
Exactly.
But, this property owners had to step in because it wasn't a viable place to live for a lot of people.
For a lot of people, and it was definitely not a great place to do business. The business environment was not that great, and
Right.
it affected the type of businesses that I know for us, we got all of the low end businesses. We were not able to attract, as they say, class A tenants, and we still struggle with that. So, but also too, some of the mistakes about bids is that people hear the word bid and it's like all bids are the same. And bids are the same in many ways, and bids are also different in their neighborhoods because their neighborhoods are different. And yours specifically was for the fashion center. So can you describe your bid and the type of services that you provide? And maybe what are some of the major differences compared to other bids?
Well, I think we're very unique as a bid. So the Garment District, which we define as, the bid is defined as 35th Street to 41, 5th Avenue to 9th Avenue. And there was a time in New York City history in the early 1900s going all the way up until about 1960, 70, I would say, where this neighborhood was exclusively fashion, design, marketing, sales, manufacturing. So there used to be 200,000 manufacturing jobs in this neighborhood for many, many years. Those are people sitting at sewing machines, not designing. When, in the 70s and the 80s, a lot of this business went south, meaning the manufacturing, because the South was non-unionized. And then eventually the South got too expensive and these jobs went overseas. So that's sort of the background. When, by the time the early 90s came, the share of both land use, the space being taken, and jobs in the Garment District that were actually manufacturing had already been diminishing for years. So since 1950 until now, every single year, without exception, including when Ed Koch put overlay zoning in the Garment District to protect manufacturing jobs, to make sure that when Times Square was redeveloped, there wouldn't be a big trickle down of all these offices and office workers who would push out the garment workers. So that was really a protectionist device, zoning. But even with that, it didn't make a blip in the job. So when I came to this job in 1995, there were 64,000 employees here, and there were probably about 25% share of the jobs. The jobs in the industry now are only 10% of the total number of jobs in the Garment District. We now have 149,000. Well, let me qualify that, pre-COVID. We have 149,000 jobs in the Garment District pre-COVID. We're at 125 now. So we lost 25,000 jobs here. But it's only, the garment industry is only 2% of the actual land use and 10% of the jobs. So during my tenure here, the focus of the organization had to change dramatically, because in the beginning, all our focus was on marketing and promoting the neighborhood as a home of American fashion, which it was for many years. But the thing is, as these different business sectors kept coming in and the fashion industry shrunk over all those years, we had to start thinking about programs that would lift all users and all visitors to the neighborhood, not just one sector. So we really pivoted, I would say about 15 years ago, to focus on the core, just so, you know, going back, the core services are sanitation and security. That is our overarching priority. But we pivoted to streetscape improvements and, you know, promoting the businesses that were here, regardless of what sector they were in and that kind of thing. So it's really been a big shift. And we took a step backwards, as did the whole wide world during COVID. But, you know, I think the most discouraging thing for us is that socially, in terms of what we were seeing on the street, year after year after year had been improving. And we were in a very good place before COVID.
Right.
And we are not in a very good place now because of social conditions on the street, which I wholly blame on city and state legislatures.
So, and that leads right into the next question here. And as you mentioned, sanitation and public safety, which is basically the core programs for most bids across the world. And then after clean and safe, then what? So for us, we looked at real estate development, and you can see, I mean, these things take time, but we now have 5 blocks and 4 development projects within those 5 blocks. So a lot of it is coming to fruition. But let's fast forward, COVID hit. 125th Street, as well as the rest of the city, was definitely impacted. And although we are on a comeback, so to say, or so to speak, we still have challenges. You know, on 125th Street, our footfall counts are lower, our vacancy rates are higher. We are dealing with crime inside the stores and on the street. We have homelessness, mental ill people on the street who need help, oversaturation of drug treatment and addiction centers. All are in close proximity of our district. And these are just some of the challenges. The bid and the city continues to work on all these challenges, but when one visits our district, it is clear that any visitor that problems still exist. I just described 125th Street. Can you describe the conditions in the garment district when COVID hit and what it's like now?
Well, so before COVID, I would say that we had, you know, homelessness, and we certainly had social problems. There's no doubt about it. And just to go back to one of the reasons we had these big social problems, and it's one of the reasons you and I have come together so strongly over the last few years, is the garment district and Harlem and the Bronx and certain other neighborhoods have way more than their fair share of social service entities. And, you know, these entities are needed because people need housing and they need supportive services and they need, you know, they have drug addictions and mental illnesses, but you can't dump them all in one neighborhood. So one of the problems that we had is the neighborhood was getting better and better and better. COVID hit. And then the city of New York moved individuals that were in congregate settings, which could mean anything from jail to supportive housing to, you know, any kind of group living situation, into hotels for social distancing for those individuals. So they moved 1,200 of these individuals that already have social challenges into hotels in the garment district. The hotels were emptied. So that's 1,200. But then in Manhattan's Midtown West, sort of, I would say between 23rd Street and 57th, 4,300. So that is an enormous number of people to dump in a neighborhood that are already suffering from mental illness, chemical addictions, that kind of thing. So,
Right.
then those, in fairness, those people were moved out when we were crested past COVID and things were improving. And what I would say is it took about a year, but we have 54 hotels in the garment district, which is 19% of the Midtown stock of hotels. And that's about 12,500 rooms. And interestingly enough, starting last summer, tourism really started coming back, domestic tourism. This summer, the international started coming back. So our hotels are at about 86% occupancy, which I think is really fantastic. Our ped counts, pedestrian counts are back to about 85 to 90% of what they were. These things are good. What's bad is the tenants aren't back. And we have no residential, we have a handful of residential buildings in the neighborhood, but we don't have enough of a critical mass of residential that it balances the optics on the street. So when our tenants came back, and that's something we're hoping to change, DCP, the mayor Adams, mayor of the city of New York, has said that he's going to allow residential in the garment district. But the idea is and it's because we were a manufacturing district, so you didn't allow residential where there was manufacturing. The reason we care so much about residential is the ground floor retail is really suffering because you can't have a business that is restricted to sort of 9 to 5 grab and go lunch businesses, drugstores, and banks. So we'd like a greater diversity of users. But the biggest challenge that occurred in COVID is when people started coming back, tenants, and they saw the social disorder on the streets, the open drug use on the streets, open dealing on the streets, mentally ill people on the streets, people defecating on the streets, they said, no, we're not coming back. No way. And they either opted for hybrid or, we had tenants that literally moved out of the neighborhood. We had big tenants said, no way, my people are not coming to work on the street. And what I will say is the NYPD, in fairness, has been extraordinary partners. They've been really, really fantastic. But they're working against policies on the part of the New York City Council that allows a lot of behaviors that were illegal 10 years ago. We have a city and state legislature that allows open needle use, that allows, they don't allow drug dealing, but there's so many things. Defecating on the street, you have to literally see somebody doing that. And it's a desk appearance ticket. And what I'm saying is, if you're going to change laws that are more benevolent towards people that have serious social challenges or mental illnesses, you have to, at the same time, have laws that deals with what happens to those people. You can't say, oh, he has a right to live on the street, he or she, and, they refused help. And, well, no, I don't think so. That's a shared street. That's my street too. So I can't make you get off drugs. I can offer you services. I can offer you options, but you can't live on the street. You're not allowed to do that. And go ahead.
So, we have these conversations, but we know that the laws do exist. And so it gets down into this whole thing. Well, first, I'd like to say that we both, share the same opinions that services are needed. And for those who are struggling. And I think that there are many problems with, there are a lot of people bringing services. So we just say services are needed. So we have to talk about the effectiveness of the services and also the laws that prevent people who are providing the services from doing things that could be helpful. There are so many layers of impediments for even those who are trying to make it better and to help. And the end result is, like, I'll give you an example. You have the community providers, you have the city, you have the state on 125th Street, we have ministers, then we have the bid. We're out there doing what we're trying to do, the city agencies. So all of us are approaching that one person on the street. So that person get approached 5 and 6 times a day. Eventually he's going to say, no, I don't want services. It's like there's no coordinated effort. And so that brings us to how we've been trying to do all this interagency stuff, which is really challenging, I have found. I think we need to talk about this, is the fact of how the agencies themselves, as it relates to communication and working on the same issue in an effective manner. That's, I've been talking about that and even tried to have my own interagency coordination here, which you have come to.
Yes.
But where do we start? Because like the laws for sure, but then when do we have people at the table who can actually, help the lawmakers to understand, what is needed when they're writing the laws?
Right. So, I mean, I sort of feel like I would just go back to right now we have a model, which is an outreach model where you offer people in distress help. And a lot of people aren't going to accept the help because they've had very traumatic things occur in their life. People don't end up living on the street and taking drugs and being mentally ill, walking around screaming, going to the bathroom, if something really, really bad didn't happen. So the idea that they just accept services, even after 50 or 100 interactions with the social service entity alone, to me, is not a resolution. I would say that outreach alone is a failed model. And the definition of insanity is when you do the same thing over and over and over again, and you expect a different outcome. So I think that our elected officials and our city government needs to revisit. We've had this situation for decades now, going back to the 80s. It's not working, and it's not working for two reasons. A, it can't just be voluntary because a lot of people don't have the intellectual or capacity or mental peace of mind, clarity to choose the very best course of action for them. Or when they took services, their experience with those services was less than satisfactory or very temporary, getting bounced around from here to there, which is very unsettling for any human. I mean, imagine if you had to move every few months, you'd go mad. And the other thing is, I think that we need to revisit this policy, and it needs to be a combination of offering help, but also disallowing you to continue to stay on the streets.
So I think though, Barbara, where there's a disconnect in so many areas. It's like, let's go back to how did they end up on the street? And we've talked about that. And so I think that's where you lose some people in terms of supporting them being moved off the street, because the causes of them being on the street, are not being addressed either.
Right.
And so in terms of the laws and how that happened and how, they cut programs, and people were then forced and had nowhere to go. The thing of it is COVID just made it all bubble up so we could see it, but it's been there for quite some time. So listen to you, why did they end up on the street? Because if we don't address that, we're going to continue, having people coming and being on the street because they have nowhere to go. Then secondly, those people who don't have the capacity, but I spoke to one of my Harlem residents and she said, how can you just say that? If I was out on the street for 3 days, I know I wouldn't have the capacity. That would drive me crazy.
Agreed.
And so, it's again, I go back to who are the right people to bring into the room to look at this whole thing from the beginning. What's causing it? How do we address the existing? And what laws are needed for the existing? And then how do we heal? It's like just taking them off the street and putting them in housing is not going to solve the problems that they had originally developed.
Right. So, I feel like right now our public policy with regard to these individuals that have these challenges, and you're 100% right, they go deep. This can go back to 5-year-old, 3-year-old, 12-year-old, so these are huge lifelong challenges that people have to deal with. I feel like our policy right now is look at them and, there, but for the grace of God, go I. No.
Right.
The folks are hurt, they're in pain, whether it's mental, emotional, spiritual, physical. And I would a little bit take exception. I think the first thing you need is housing, but you need all different kinds of housing because some people are going to need full-on supportive. Think of our peers. Think of the availability of help that we have if our kids, well, I have kids. I don't know if you have kids.
I don't.
Get in trouble. But, I have the doctors and I have a counselor and I have a shrink, or there's this incredible network, which you have to pay for. It has to be paid for, of services out there to try and help us meet our challenges, whether it's some emotional challenge or a child that has autism or schizophrenia or ADD. I think I'm making this up now, but I think, people have ADD. Back in the old days, we just called them greasers. They were hanging out in the parking lot of the high school and skipping classes. Well, you wouldn't think of them now. You'd say, oh, why are they skipping all their classes? So all I'm saying is there are tremendous resources available to people if you have money and if you're in the right school. And if you have the right teachers and mentors and counselors that are there, everybody falls down. And, think of, they say it takes a village, and it really does, whether it's my neighbors helping me or the school counselor directing me or somewhere. So I agree with you. I think we need housing because people need shelter, But
that is an immediate need. I mean, people should not be living on the sidewalk. That just brings additional problems to them. So we're gonna pick this up. This is a great conversation. We're gonna take a quick station break and then come back in about 3 to 4 minutes. You are listening to 125th Street and Beyond on 90.3 FM. I am your host, Barbara Askins. We are having a great conversation on the oversaturation of community drug treatment facilities and the needs for the special population in our commercial districts with Barbara Blair from the Garment District. We will take a short station break, and when we come back, we will continue this discussion. You are listening to 125th Street and Beyond on 90.3 FM. I am your host, Barbara Askins. Today with our guest, Barbara Blair from the Garment District, we are discussing the impacts of oversaturation and drug treatment facilities and homelessness on the street. Before the break, we described some of the problems, and we also talked about a lot of efforts that are taking place. Like there's efforts from the state. So let's go through this a little bit, Barbara. We know the state have programs, and they're the ones who are funding a lot of the programs that are oversaturating our efforts. I mean, our districts. And it's very difficult to be able to get the state to understand our argument. Quickly, for about 1 minute, do you want to respond to the impediments that we run into with the state?
I think the oversaturation is a serious problem for neighborhoods and other users of those neighborhoods. And the state and city has been able to dump certain uses in certain neighborhoods because there was no pushback. And what I would say is the first thing you do is codify in the planning process the concept of fair share. I understand NIMBY. Nobody wants these uses in their neighborhood, but these are uses that as a society we must have. And so our city and state legislators must insist that every single district in the city and state take their fair share of uses that are really tough to live next to.
So that leads to, let's talk about this. Back in 1995, a fair share assessment of New York facilities siting process was done. A report was done for the mayor and the city planning commission. It stated the 1989 city charter required the city planning commission to adopt criteria to further the fair distribution of the burdens and benefits associated with city facilities, consistent with community needs for services, and efficient and cost-effective delivery of services and with due regard for the social and economic impacts of such facilities upon the areas surrounding the sites. It further states that the charter mandate was prompted by the widespread perception and sometimes the reality that some communities were becoming dumping grounds for unwanted city facilities. Now that was 1995, and isn't that the same stuff we're talking about right now?
Well, it's the same stuff, but I'll tell you, as with most legislation, there's a loophole. So it says city services. So the Garment District has 21 shelters in the Garment District. So it's a very small geographical area, as I said, because we were a manufacturing district. You could put them here, you could dump them here, and there was no residential pushback. So, but the city subcontracts out to nonprofit organizations.
Right.
So it's a nonprofit organization that is leasing the space in the neighborhood. So it's a city service, but it's like a loophole. It's not a city facility. It's a nonprofit facility. So that's one thing where I would say, first of all, you've got to close that loophole. You've got to make it part of the planning process that it doesn't have to just be city services. It has to be LULUs, locally unwanted land use, which everybody knows the concept of that. And it has to go through some public process. And I'm going to give you one small example. During COVID, as I said, we had 1,200 individuals placed here in our hotels. It was mayhem on the streets. 4,300 in the West Side, Midtown West. Upper West Side, one shelter at the Lucerne, right. As you may recall. The people on the Upper West Side went bananas, out of their mind. Now they have other shelters up there. I'm not saying they don't. And that shelter was moved.
But Barbara, we are going bananas here in Harlem, and it's not happening. I've introduced you to some of the people. We've had press conferences. People have stormed into the board meetings of some of the people who are providing these services, and it's still, we're getting more. Like de Blasio made the first injection center in Harlem, and the whole state, right where we are already completely oversaturated. So I'm saying, I think you're right. We do have to make more noise. And
but I think one of the problems, one of the things that you and I have spoken about is if my city council representatives, because we have this problem, and your city council representatives and the representatives from the Bronx where this is happening, or Bed-Stuy where this is happening, well, Bed-Stuy is getting totally gentrified, but you know what I mean, right. All got together and required legislation where the concept of fair share was codified in both the planning and the approval process for uses. But it's almost impossible for it to happen because you're going to have 5 neighborhoods that are going to want it codified and all the other neighborhoods that don't, because if things are spread around the entire city or around the entire state, that means you're getting some of them, Right. I mean, right. I might not get new ones, but you're going to get some, and nobody right. wants that. So it's almost, one of the problems I think we're facing on a national and state and local level is when you're an elected official, you should have this sort of global understanding of what's good for us as a nation, us as a city, us as a state. What are the needs of these various levels? And then, of course, you're elected by your home district to represent them, and your district might have very specific needs, like, you want to have coal mines, and the rest of us think we shouldn't have any more coal mines. But unless there's both a globalist interest that you're balancing with the local interest, all you're going to have is legislators that are fighting each other so they don't get the unwanted land use.
Well, the unwanted land use, and also too, the politics of it, and we have to bring that to the table because also politically, someone may be trying to help solve the problem. But then we understand with the politics, there's give and take. I think that's a good way of saying it, give
Yeah.
and take. And I
Yeah.
think that's where we're getting lost in the shuffle of the give and take, because we're not at the table. We can talk to our elected officials, and I do, and you do, and everyone seems to understand. But one thing that is constant, the problem is growing. There's a
Right.
lot of effort, and everyone understand what needs to be done, but there's always something that keep us from moving forward. So this is why I'm excited that we are having this conversation, and maybe others need to talk about it as well, because we can't continue living like this with the people on the street and younger people coming out of college don't want to live in these conditions and don't find New York as attractive as they used to.
Yeah.
And so our industry has evolved now to where before it was just clean and safe, we now call ourselves placemakers.
Mhm,
So, okay, we're trying to make a place for everyone, and we have these problems. So I think one of the things we can do as bids is to try to elevate our voices, like you're saying, with our elected officials. And how do we do this and have them to see that we are an extension of, we're someone to help them, not,
mhm.
go against what they're trying to accomplish as well. And then to understand the social impacts, because that's the whole problem here is the social issues have never been addressed adequately. And
Right.
when they're trying to make laws and compensate for that, we get all of these loopholes that you're talking about.
Right. Well, also, I think one of the things that gets lost, because of course, everything costs money. So a facility where you can live, where you have support, on-site support 24/7. And, a lot of the folks that are picked up off the street in the garment district are brought to a hospital. They're brought to Bellevue. Either they refuse service or they're brought to Bellevue. Bellevue doesn't hold them for more than 72 hours. Then they'll say, okay, we made an appointment for you at this place next Tuesday, go to Queens and,
Yeah.
blah, 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 blah. Now, think about this. If you have a family member or a friend who is in crisis because of whatever, drugs, mental illness, I don't know. This is what they have that the folks on my streets don't have. Your sister, first of all, comes over right away. And oh my God, and la la la. Well, let's go to the hospital. Let's go to the hospital, Barbara. We go to the hospital. They do whatever they do in the emergency room. They send me home. But then my sister makes sure that, next Tuesday, I go to Queens and I go to that place. She checks in with me every single day. Then when we get to Queens, I'm making this up. We get to Queens, she makes sure I'm settled in and that she, when my parents went to assisted living, I knew the administrators. I make sure those nurses know me. I make sure my mom and dad are being taken care of. The role of government, and there are a lot of people that are anti-government, so I'm sorry for their troubles, because government, they don't even realize how government is making their lives livable. The role of government is to provide for the needs of the citizenry where there are gaps where they can't take care of themselves. And so the continuum of care, like the outreach on the street, you shouldn't be able to bring someone to a hospital and then leave them and come back here and continue your job. There should be someone assigned to that person that doesn't leave their side until they're settled in a safe place. So these are the gaps, and of course, then what you're going to hear is, well, it costs a lot of money to have these facilities where people can live. Yeah, it costs a lot of money, and guess what? You get what you pay for.
So, Barbara, one of the things I think that's hurting us as business improvement district managers is we talk, which down and like we're the authority and this is what should happen. And I'm saying that because we have to have these frank conversations, because that pushes elected officials and those professionals who understand the conditions of these people better than we do, and we need their support. This is something that I've been looking at, because what they see us as, you're just trying to protect your businesses. But these people need,
Oh,
and I understand we may not agree with them, but they have a certain leverage of not only importance, but also clout and power in this thing, just like we do. And so this is where my mind is. How do we all come together? Just language. Because when I first started and I kept saying people with special needs, people who were professionals and provided services told me that was offensive. So words and language, how we talk about those people who needs it. There's a learning curve. I think if we want to push and try to help, that we need to learn a little bit more about this social stuff, because I think we need them. We need them
Oh,
to
I
carry a
totally
lot of
agree.
our arguments.
Yeah.
So that's the problem, and we haven't been able to engage them to carry these arguments for us.
Well, and so also in fairness, I mean, not to demonize elected officials, because it's a job I wouldn't want. It's an incredibly challenging job. And in my neighborhood, my two council members, Councilmember Keith Powers and Eric Botcher, have been very effective in certain ways. Councilmember Eric Botcher, we know, cares a lot about mental health and has written legislation about mental health. Councilmember Keith Powers just gave $100,000 to have a study conducted in the area about maybe new tactics for facilities in the area, not facilities, but a presence in the area of outreach. So I don't mean to demonize them. I think that most of our elected officials really, really care about their neighborhoods and districts. But I think that just the challenges of both getting the funding and the continuum of care and NIMBY problems and, codifying, disallowing oversaturation. These are big, big problems. And
they're
yeah.
big problems. And again, they're elected officials, and they fund a lot of these programs, and they are their constituencies as well. And
Right.
so it's, again, like you said, there's layers and layers and layers. And so coming up with a solution, going back to what you were saying, is I think you hit up on something. If some kind of way we can get those districts who have this problem to speak with their elected officials, collectively, that's a good start. And then to hear where they are, and maybe we need to bring in the people who are providing the services also, because I just had an interview with Cassandra White, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Homeless Services here in New York City. And just looking at how they address the problem, I became enlightened. Like, one of the things she said, when they approach, they have to analyze the person and look, they might have a sore on them that is open. And so the immediate course of action wouldn't be to get that homeless person into housing, is to get them to the hospital.
Right.
And so she went through the whole gamut of how they engage. And then after, even if that person doesn't want to go to the hospital, that becomes challenging. So the city agencies, too, understanding how they work more, it is very complex. So I wanted to just ask you before we close here in a little bit, about this interagency work that we've been doing. SBS, Department of Small Business Services, does bring us all together. The Bid Association, which is all 78 bids, we have our own association. Then we have a Manhattan delegation, and then we work with other organizations. Like, we're working overtime, falling all over each other. How do we and I'm putting you on the spot here, all these different efforts, are we going anywhere? Do you see how we can combine some of this stuff to be another layer of making a bigger bang?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the Bid Managers Association is a good place to start. One of the reasons that we started the Midtown Bid Coalition, it was during COVID. And we all had a lot of the same social conditions. So it was very specifically about crime, retail crime, mental illness, and drug addiction on the street. And this is not homelessness that I'm talking about.
Right, I know.
It's a different group of people. And we were really struggling with it, and we were trying to share information, and we had many meetings with our elected officials, DA Bragg, they all walked through the neighborhood. So, but that was because we shared very specific conditions. The Bid Managers Association, because it's a much larger organization and the neighborhoods are so different. I mean, there are bids that have, one security and one sanitation. Their biggest problem is illegal vendors. There are
Right.
other bids, I used to love the open restaurants. Now I hate the open restaurants, get them off the streets. They are taking up space and creating visual clutter. In Park Slope, the open restaurants are beautiful. They're an asset to the neighborhood. So I think the reason we formed that sort of mini committee is because we weren't going to be that global. We were talking about things that were very specific to Midtown. The experience of residential communities post-COVID has been very, very different. They've had job growth. Some of those businesses in those residential neighborhoods are doing great. We're not, because commercial tenants didn't come back, so no one's buying lunch anymore.
Right.
So, that's why I think you have these different groups. What I would say, though, is we're all talking to the same people, because we're talking to our state and city elected officials. And
Right.
I would say, for my part, my state and city elected officials for the Garment District area are very, very aware of all the problems I've talked about. But
Right.
then they've got to take that back to the Assembly and the Senate and get people that are from upstate New York or
There you go.
Long Island to realize, New York City is hugely important to upstate and the viability of the rest of the state. And you can't just, balkanize the city and build a wall around it because you don't want our problems. They're our problems.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to bring that also. Even when our elected officials understand what we're saying and the impacts, then they run into the problems of getting their other colleagues in, particularly at the state level, because it has come back to me on our whole shoplifting issue. Even when we tell them, some of our businesses were getting hit back during COVID 40, 50, 60 times a day. What came back to me was they didn't believe it. And so how can you at least, or if you're not going to believe, you could at least come and see. It's not to hold back everything. So these barriers for us as New York City people, we have a lobbyist. Maybe we need to have a discussion of how we're going to.
Well, also, I used to always think, so I'm going to use the COVID shoplifting as an example.
Okay.
We have people that have been arrested 40, 50, 100 times. They get a desk appearance ticket. They don't go to jail. We don't want to throw anyone in jail, because Rikers Island, you'll get murdered if you go to jail. Right. I agree. But to me, if you're a state official, okay, you don't want anyone to go to jail. They're recidivists. They the same thing over and over and over. They're a menace to the businesses, and a menace to the people that live and work here. What should we do? Don't tell me what you don't want us to do anymore. Okay, they're not going to jail. They've been arrested 100 times. What should we do? And then you talk about diversion. I mean, who enforces diversion?
Well, that's true. And I think that's where we are as a city right now, and maybe as a country, because it's at the point where, how do you get people to not commit the crime? I think that's the beginning of the discussion, which take you to a whole level, different level of understanding. And I'm just beginning to hear, movement in that direction, because the existing laws are not going to stop it. I'm going to allow you to give your last closing words. We're coming to the end of our show. This has been very, 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 very helpful to me, and I hope to our audience. Because a lot of people do not understand how business improvement districts work. And so, Barbara, your last words.
Well, I would say, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, Barbara. It's really lovely, and it's lovely to be able to share this time with you. I think, in my experience, all the bid directors that I've met in this city are at heart humanists and people that want to improve neighborhoods for everyone that lives and works and visits those neighborhoods. And people think it's just the property owners. It's not just the property owners. Of course it's not. So, I mean, I think what they're really trying to be at a very grassroots level, where if you have a problem with the city agency or a problem with the business, we can be ombudsmen or problem solvers or whatever. But, I think their bids are a great asset to the city of New York. And, I hope, I hope that we can find our way through the social thicket that we're now in.
Well, I think we will, but I think what has to happen is we as bids, just like we incorporated sanitation, public safety, real estate development, housing, we may start looking at how to incorporate social services, as a part of our operations. And some bids are doing that across, the nation. I'm a member of the International Downtown Association, and I see some examples, and we're not doing that. So some bids are already doing it. And because the one thing that we do, we are held accountable, we're transparent, and we're audited. So I think we're in a better position to be able to, bring together the information and the people in a meaningful way. You have been listening to 125th Street and Beyond on WHCR 90.3 FM. I'm Barbara Askins, your host. My guest today has been Barbara Blair from the Fashion Center Garment District. And we had a great discussion today on social services, homelessness, mental illness, placemaking, how to make our commercial districts better for everyone who live, work, and visit. Thank you very much. Make sure you tune in on Mondays at 4 p.m. on 90.3 FM for 125th Street and Beyond.